The child's wail cut through the desert silence like a knife through canvas, raw and desperate, echoing off the Red Canyon walls where shadows pooled like spilled ink. Marcus Thorne pulled his horse to a halt, dust settling around the mare's hooves as he tilted his head, listening. The sound came again, weaker now, a thread of sound that might have been wind through stone, if not for its broken rhythm. He had been riding for 3 days straight, pushing hard toward the mining camp at Silver Creek, his saddlebags heavy with medicine and supplies for the fever that had taken hold there. Time was precious, lives hung in the balance, but that cry had pulled at something deep in his chest, something he thought he had buried years ago along with his wife and daughter. Marcus dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the packed earth with a soft thud. He tied the reins to a twisted juniper and pulled his rifle from its scabbard, though something told him he would not need it. The crying was coming from a cluster of boulders ahead, where the trail bent around a massive red stone formation. As he approached, the sound grew clearer, more defined, the sobbing of a child, alone and terrified. He rounded the boulder and stopped short. There, huddled in a shallow depression between 2 rocks, was a small figure wrapped in a torn deerskin dress. A girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, with long black hair matted with dust and tears streaming down her bronze cheeks. Her feet were bare and bloodied, her small hands clutched around a broken clay pot. She looked up at him with eyes wide with terror, dark as obsidian, and filled with the kind of fear that comes from having seen too much. Too young. She pressed herself back against the stone, her crying stopping abruptly as if someone had cut her voice away with a blade. Marcus lowered his rifle immediately, setting it aside and raising his hands where she could see them. "Easy there, little one," he said softly, his voice gentle as summer rain. "I'm not going to hurt you." She said nothing, only watched him with those enormous eyes, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. Marcus had seen enough abandoned children on the trails to know the signs. She was Apache. He could tell from the beadwork on her dress and the way her hair had been braided, though the braids were coming loose now, tangled with thorns and desert grass. She was alone, which meant something terrible had happened to her people. The broken pot at her feet told part of the story. Water, precious and life-giving, now soaking uselessly into the thirsty earth. He crouched down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. "You thirsty?" he asked, reaching for his canteen. The sound of water sloshing inside made her eyes widen, and she licked her cracked lips involuntarily. He poured water into his cupped palm and held it out to her. She stared at it for a long moment, torn between desperate need and ingrained caution. Finally, thirst won. She crawled forward on her hands and knees and drank from his palm like a small animal, her tongue darting out to catch every precious drop. When she finished, she looked up at him again, and this time there was something different in her eyes, not trust, not yet, but a recognition that he meant her no harm. "More?" he asked, and she nodded quickly. He poured again, and again she drank, this time not quite so desperately. When her thirst was slaked, Marcus pulled a piece of hardtack from his pocket and broke it in half. He offered her one piece and took a bite of the other, showing her it was safe. She took it with trembling fingers and bit into it carefully, her small teeth working at the tough bread. As she ate, Marcus studied her more closely. The dress she wore was well made, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns he recognized as Apache. Her hair, beneath the dust and tangles, was thick and lustrous. This was no wild child or orphan. She had been loved, cared for, part of a family, which made her presence here, alone and terrified, all the more heartbreaking. "Where's your family, little one?" he asked gently. She looked up at him with those dark eyes, but said nothing. He tried again in the few Apache words he knew, picked up during his years of trading with the peaceful bands that sometimes came to the settlements. Her eyes widened slightly when she heard her own language, but still she remained silent. Marcus nodded, understanding. Some wounds were too deep for words, especially in a child so young. He pulled out his bedroll and spread it in the shade of the largest boulder. "You rest here," he said, patting the blanket. "I'll keep watch." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Marcus knew he should push on. The medicine in his saddlebags was desperately needed at Silver Creek, and every hour's delay might mean another life lost to the fever. But he could not leave this child alone in the desert. She would die within days, maybe hours, if the night predators found her first. He made his decision with the certainty that had carried him through years of frontier life. The medicine would have to wait. As the shadows lengthened, Marcus gathered wood for a small fire. The child watched his every movement, her small body tense and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. But as the flames caught and began to dance, casting warm light across her face, some of the tension seemed to leave her shoulders. He opened his pack and pulled out his meager supplies, a can of beans, some dried meat, the last of his coffee. It was not much, but it would keep them both alive for another day or two. As the beans heated over the fire, their rich aroma filled the small space between the boulders. The child's nose twitched, and he saw her swallow hard, her stomach probably cramping with hunger. When the food was ready, he served her first, using his own spoon to feed her small, careful portions. She ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be her last. "What's your name?" he asked as she ate. She looked up at him but remained silent, her dark eyes unreadable. He tried again in Apache, the words clumsy on his tongue. This time she tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether to answer. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Aiyana." The name seemed to float in the air between them, delicate as smoke. Marcus smiled gently. "Aiyana, that's a beautiful name. I'm Marcus." She nodded solemnly, as if accepting this formal introduction. As full darkness settled over the desert, Marcus banked the fire and settled down on his bedroll. Aiyana had curled up in the corner where the two boulders met, her small form almost invisible in the shadows. He could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, and he knew she was not asleep. "It's all right," he said softly into the darkness. "You're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." There was no response, but gradually her breathing began to slow and deepen. Marcus lay awake for a long time, staring up at the stars and thinking about the child who had wandered into his life like a ghost from his past. His own daughter would have been about Aiyana's age now if she had lived. Sarah had been 6 when the fever took her, and Marcus could still remember the weight of her small body in his arms, the way her dark hair fell across his shoulder when he carried her to bed. The memory was a blade that twisted in his chest, sharp and familiar. He had been away when it happened, trading horses in the next territory over. By the time he returned, both Sarah and his wife Emma were already in the ground, victims of the same kind of fever he was now racing to fight at Silver Creek. The irony was not lost on him. Morning came with the soft pink light of dawn, filtering through the canyon walls. Marcus woke to find Aiyana sitting up, watching him with those grave, dark eyes. She had not run during the night, which surprised him. Most wild things, human or otherwise, fled at the first opportunity. But she had stayed, perhaps because some instinct told her that her chances were better with him than alone in the desert. He sat up and stretched, his joints protesting after a night on the hard ground. "Morning, little one," he said. She nodded gravely in response. They shared the last of his coffee and some more hardtack, a meager breakfast but better than nothing. As they ate, Marcus found himself studying the child's face in the growing light. There was something familiar about her features, something that nagged at the edges of his memory, the high cheekbones, the shape of her eyes, the particular pattern of beadwork on her dress. He had seen these things before, but where? As the sun climbed higher, bringing with it the promise of another scorching day, Marcus faced a decision. He could not take Aiyana with him to Silver Creek. The mining camp was no place for a child, especially an Apache child. The miners were rough men, many of them with a deep hatred for the native tribes who they saw as obstacles to their wealth. But he could not leave her here alone, and he could not abandon his mission to the fever victims. The answer came to him as he was repacking his supplies. Fort Bowie was only a day's ride to the south, and he knew the commander there, Colonel Harrison. The man was fair-minded, not like some of the Indian haters who wore the blue uniform. If Marcus explained the situation, Harrison might be willing to help find Aiyana's people, or at least ensure she was cared for until a solution could be found. It would mean another delay in reaching Silver Creek, but it was the only choice he could live with. He knelt down in front of Aiyana and spoke gently. "I need to take you somewhere safe," he said. "There are good people who will help you." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. There was an acceptance in her eyes that was heartbreaking in one so young, the resignation of someone who had already lost everything and expected nothing more from life. Marcus lifted her onto his horse, settling her in front of him, where he could keep her secure. She was light as a feather, all bones and skin beneath the deerskin dress. As they began to ride, she leaned back against his chest, and he felt something shift inside him, a protective instinct that he thought had died with his own family. The journey to Fort Bowie took them through some of the most beautiful and dangerous country in the territory. Red mesas rose like ancient temples from the desert floor, their surfaces carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels along the trail, their arms reaching toward the endless blue sky. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace. It was a land that could kill you without mercy, but it could also take your breath away with its harsh beauty. Aiyana said little during the ride, but Marcus could feel her gradually relaxing against him. Once, when they stopped to rest the horse and take shelter from the midday heat, she surprised him by speaking. "My grandmother told me stories," she said in her soft, careful English, "about the white eyes who helped our people." Marcus looked down at her, surprised by the sudden communication. "What kind of stories?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, as if deciding whether to continue. "She said some white eyes have good hearts. They see people, not enemies." Her words hit him like a physical blow, the simple wisdom of a child cutting through years of frontier cynicism. That afternoon, as they approached the final ridge before Fort Bowie, Aiyana suddenly stiffened in the saddle. Marcus felt the change immediately, the way her small body went rigid with tension. He followed her gaze and saw what had caught her attention. A dust cloud on the horizon, moving fast and purposeful. Riders coming from the direction of the fort. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle, but Aiyana caught his wrist with surprising strength. "No," she whispered. "Wait." There was something in her voice, an urgency that made him pause. The riders crested the ridge ahead of them, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. They were Apache warriors, painted for war, their faces stern and fierce. At their head rode a man Marcus recognized, Chief Nalnish of the Chiricahua, a leader known for his wisdom and his fierce protection of his people. The warriors spread out as they approached, surrounding Marcus and Aiyana with practiced efficiency. Marcus raised his hands slowly, showing he was not reaching for weapons, but his mind was racing. How had they found them? How had they known? Chief Nalnish rode forward, his dark eyes fixed on the child in Marcus's arms. When he spoke, it was in Apache, his voice carrying the authority of command. Aiyana responded immediately, her own voice high and clear as she spoke rapidly in her native tongue. Marcus could not understand the words, but he could hear the emotion, relief, joy, grief all mixed together in the child's voice. The chief's stern expression softened as he listened, and when Aiyana finished speaking, he looked at Marcus with something that might have been respect. "You are the one called Thorne," the chief said in English, his accent thick, but his words clear. "The horse trader." Marcus nodded, surprised that the man knew his name. "You have done a great service to my people," Nalnish continued. This child is my granddaughter, lost to us 3 days ago when her family was killed by Mexican raiders near the border. We have been searching, following signs and whispers. The pieces fell into place in Marcus's mind. The broken pot, the child's terror, the familiar features he had recognized. These were Chief Nalnish's people, and Aiyana was blood of his blood. The chief gestured to 2 of his warriors, who rode forward. One was older, his face marked by years and weather, his eyes kind despite the fierce paint across his cheeks. The other was younger, barely more than a boy, but there was a resemblance to Aiyana in his features that spoke of family. "My sons," Nalnish explained. "They will escort you to your destination as thanks for what you have done." Marcus started to protest, but the chief held up a hand. "We know of the sickness at Silver Creek," he said. "Our scouts have watched, have seen the suffering. The medicine you carry, it is needed. We will see that you arrive safely." Aiyana slipped down from the horse and ran to her grandfather, who swept her up in his arms. The transformation in the child was immediate and profound. The frightened, silent waif who had huddled in the rocks was gone, replaced by a normal little girl, chattering excitedly in Apache as she was reunited with her family. Marcus watched the reunion with mixed emotions, happiness for the child, but also a deep sense of loss. For a brief time, he had felt like a father again, responsible for another life, needed and necessary. Chief Nalnish approached him, still holding Aiyana in his arms. "You have children?" he asked quietly. Marcus shook his head, the old pain stirring in his chest. "I had a daughter," he said. "She would have been about Aiyana's age." The chief nodded, understanding passing between them without need for words. "The spirits guide us to where we are needed," he said. "Perhaps they brought you to my granddaughter for reasons beyond our understanding." He paused, then continued. "Among my people, there is a saying: the kindness shown to one child ripples outward like water, touching lives we cannot see. Your kindness will not be forgotten." The chief set Aiyana down and spoke to her quietly in Apache. She nodded solemnly, then ran back to Marcus. Without hesitation, she threw her small arms around his waist, hugging him with fierce intensity. "Thank you," she whispered in English. "Thank you for seeing me as people, not enemy." Marcus knelt down and hugged her back, his throat tight with emotion. "You take care of yourself, little one," he said. "Be strong like your grandfather." She nodded gravely, then reached into her dress and pulled out something small, a piece of turquoise, carved in the shape of a bird in flight. She pressed it into his palm, closing his fingers around it. "For your daughter," she said simply, "so she knows you helped." The parting was swift after that, as such partings must be in hard country where sentiment could be dangerous. Chief Nalnish's sons, who introduced themselves as Kuruk and Bidzil, fell in beside Marcus as he resumed his journey towards Silver Creek. They rode in comfortable silence, these 3 men from different worlds, brought together by circumstance and a child's need. The Apache warriors were skilled trackers and fighters, their presence making the dangerous trail seem safer, more navigable. As they rode, Marcus found himself thinking about what the chief had said about kindness rippling outward like water. He had fed a hungry child, given her water when she was dying of thirst, protected her for one night in the desert. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, barely worth considering, but it had brought him face to face with Chief Nalnish, one of the most respected leaders of the Apache nation, and had earned him an escort through dangerous territory. More than that, it had awakened something in him that he thought had died with his own family, a sense of purpose, of connection to something larger than his own grief. The sun was setting behind the mountains when they finally saw the smoke of Silver Creek rising from the valley ahead. The mining camp sprawled along the banks of a narrow stream, a collection of tents and rough wooden buildings that housed nearly 300 miners and their families. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that something was wrong. There were too few people moving about, too little activity for a camp that size. The fever had taken hold with a vengeance. Kuruk and Bidzil stopped at the edge of the camp, unwilling to venture into the white man's settlement. "We leave you here," Kuruk said in his careful English. "Our father said to tell you the debt is paid, but the friendship remains." Marcus nodded, understanding. He had not expected them to follow him into Silver Creek, where their presence might be seen as a threat. "Tell your father I am honored by his trust," he said, "and tell Aiyana I will think of her often." The two warriors wheeled their horses and disappeared into the gathering dusk, as silently as they had appeared. Marcus rode into Silver Creek alone, his saddlebags heavy with medicine and his heart heavy with the weight of what he would find there. The camp doctor, a grizzled man named Patterson, met him at the makeshift hospital with tears in his eyes. "Thank God you made it," he said, his voice cracking with exhaustion and relief. "We've lost 37 so far, including 6 children. I was starting to think we were all doomed." Marcus handed over the medicine without ceremony, already rolling up his sleeves to help. There would be time for explanations later. Now there was work to do, lives to save, a debt to pay forward. For 3 days and nights, Marcus worked alongside Dr. Patterson and the few healthy volunteers, distributing medicine, tending the sick, comforting the dying. The fever was brutal, taking the young and old first, leaving families shattered in its wake. But the medicine he had brought began to turn the tide. One by one, the sick began to recover. Children who had lain near death opened their eyes and asked for water. Mothers who had been too weak to lift their heads sat up and held their babies. The sound of crying, which had filled the camp for weeks, gradually gave way to the sound of laughter and conversation. On the 4th morning, as Marcus was checking on the last of the serious cases, a commotion outside the hospital tent caught his attention. He stepped outside to find a crowd gathering around 3 Apache warriors who had ridden boldly into the center of camp. The miners were reaching for their weapons, tensions rising fast, but Marcus recognized the riders immediately. Chief Nalnish sat his horse with calm dignity, flanked by Kuruk and Bidzil. In the chief's arms sat Aiyana, her face bright with excitement. "Easy, men," Marcus called out, stepping between the miners and the Apaches. "These are friends." The miners looked at him with confusion and suspicion, but his authority as the man who had brought the medicine carried weight. Chief Nalnish dismounted slowly, helping Aiyana down beside him. She ran immediately to Marcus, throwing her arms around his waist in greeting. "I told grandfather about the sick people," she said in her clear English. "He wanted to help." The chief approached Marcus with measured steps, aware that he was surrounded by armed men who might see him as an enemy. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the camp. "My people know of sickness," he said. "We know of herbs, of healing. We have brought gifts." He gestured to his sons, who began unpacking bundles from their horses. Inside were plants and roots that Marcus had never seen, along with clay pots filled with mysterious powders and liquids. "Doctor." Patterson pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in his hand, and curiosity written across his weathered face. Chief Nalnish spoke to him directly, his English careful but clear. "White medicine is strong," he said, "but desert teaches other ways of healing. Together, may be better." The doctor looked at the Apache remedies with the eye of a man who had seen too much death and was willing to try anything that might prevent more. "Show me," he said simply. What followed was one of the most remarkable collaborations Marcus had ever witnessed. Chief Nalnish and his people worked alongside Dr. Patterson, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of desert survival. The Apache remedies proved effective against the lingering effects of the fever, speeding recovery and preventing complications that the white medicine could not touch. Within a week, Silver Creek was transformed from a dying camp to a thriving community once again. But the real transformation was in the people themselves. The miners, who had arrived with the typical frontier prejudices against the Apache, found themselves working side by side with warriors and medicine women, learning that survival in the harsh desert required cooperation, not conflict. Children who had been taught to fear the savage Indians were soon playing games with Aiyana and learning Apache words for the animals and plants around them. Marcus found himself at the center of it all, serving as translator and mediator between two worlds that had been enemies for so long. The small kindness he had shown to a crying child on the trail had grown into something far larger, a bridge between cultures, a healing that went beyond medicine. He thought often of Chief Nalnish's words about kindness rippling outward like water, and he began to understand the truth of it. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the mountains and the sounds of a healthy, thriving camp filled the air, Marcus sat outside his tent with Aiyana beside him. She was teaching him words in Apache, her small hands shaping the sounds as she corrected his pronunciation. "Shike," she said, pointing to herself. "Friend." He repeated the word carefully, and she nodded approvingly. "Shike," she said again, pointing to him. "Friend." Chief Nalnish approached them, his step light for such a large man. "Tomorrow we return to our lands," he said, settling down beside them. "The rains come soon, and our people need us." Marcus nodded, understanding but feeling the approaching loss keenly. In the weeks since the fever had broken, he had grown close to the chief and his family, finding in them the sense of belonging he had lost when his own family died. "You could come with us," the chief said quietly. "There is always place for a man of good heart among our people." The offer was sincere. Marcus could hear it in the older man's voice. For a moment, he considered it seriously. What did he have to keep him in the white world? His trading routes, his business connections, his solitary life moving from settlement to settlement. It seemed empty compared to the sense of family and purpose he had found among the Apache. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew his answer. "I'm honored by the offer," he said, "but my path lies among my own people. There are others like Silver Creek, places where sickness and suffering could be prevented if someone cared enough to act." He paused, looking down at Aiyana, who was listening intently despite the adult nature of the conversation. "What you've taught me here about healing, about cooperation, about seeing people as people, I need to carry that forward." Chief Nalnish nodded slowly, approval in his dark eyes. "The greatest warriors are those who fight for understanding, not victory," he said. "You will be welcome among our people always, as brother." He reached into his shirt and pulled out something wrapped in soft deerskin. When he unfolded it, Marcus saw a necklace made of silver and turquoise, crafted with exquisite skill. "This belonged to my father and his father before him," the chief said. "It is given only to those who have proven themselves friends to our people, protectors of our children." Marcus accepted the necklace with the solemnity it deserved, understanding that he was receiving not just a gift, but a responsibility. As Chief Nalnish placed it around his neck, he felt the weight of it, both physical and spiritual. "I will wear it with honor," he said. Aiyana clapped her hands together, her face bright with joy at seeing two of her favorite people share this moment of connection. The next morning came too soon, as such mornings always do. The Apache prepared to leave, with the efficient grace of people accustomed to movement, to following the seasons and the needs of their tribe. Marcus helped them pack, his throat tight with emotions he could not quite name. When everything was ready, Chief Nalnish mounted his horse and reached down for Aiyana. She hesitated for a moment, looking back at Marcus with those grave, dark eyes. "Will I see you again?" she asked, her voice small in the vast desert air. Marcus knelt down and took her hands in his, the turquoise bird she had given him pressed between their palms. "Paths have a way of crossing when they're meant to," he said. "And besides, friends carry each other in their hearts, no matter how far apart they are." She nodded solemnly, then surprised him by leaning forward and kissing his cheek, a gesture so naturally affectionate that it nearly broke his composure. As the Apache rode away, becoming smaller and smaller against the vast landscape until they disappeared entirely, Marcus stood watching long after they were gone. The miners of Silver Creek began to return to their normal routines, but the camp was forever changed. The cooperation between Apache and White that had begun during the fever crisis continued, creating a model of coexistence that would be talked about throughout the territory. Marcus himself was changed as well. He continued his trading routes, but with a new purpose. He carried medicines to isolated settlements, negotiated peaceful agreements between ranchers and tribal lands, and always looked for children in need. The necklace Chief Nalnish had given him became known throughout the territory, a symbol of safe passage and honorable dealing that opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Years passed, and Marcus's hair grew grey, then white. His face became weathered by sun and wind, marked by the lines that come from squinting at distant horizons and smiling at unexpected friendships. He never married again, never had children of his own, but he became a father figure to dozens of lost and abandoned young ones, both white and native. His name became legend in certain circles, spoken with respect around campfires and in tribal councils. On a spring morning, when the desert was painted with wildflowers and the air was sweet with the promise of new life, Marcus was riding the familiar trail between Silver Creek and Fort Bowie when he heard a sound that stopped him cold. It was singing, a woman's voice raised in an Apache lullaby, clear and beautiful in the morning air. He followed the sound to a grove of cottonwoods beside a stream, and there he found her. Aiyana sat in the shade of the largest tree, no longer a frightened child, but a young woman of perhaps 20, beautiful and strong. In her arms she held a baby, and beside her sat a young Apache man with kind eyes and gentle hands. She looked up as Marcus approached, and her face broke into a smile of pure joy. "Shike," she called out, using the word she had taught him so many years ago. Friend. The reunion was everything Marcus could have hoped for and more. Aiyana introduced her husband, a warrior named Takoda who had heard stories of the white man who saved children and wore the silver necklace of friendship. Their baby, a girl with her mother's dark eyes and her father's strong features, reached out tiny hands toward Marcus as if recognizing a kindred spirit. "I named her Imala," Aiyana said, her voice full of pride and happiness. "It means strong-minded, like someone I once knew who fed a crying child when he could have ridden past." Marcus held the baby carefully, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers, the alert dark eyes that seemed to see everything. In her face he saw echoes of her mother, of Chief Nalnish, of all the children he had helped over the years. "Grandfather died last winter," Aiyana said softly, and Marcus felt the loss like a physical blow. "But before he passed, he told me to find you, to tell you that the kindness you showed a lost child had grown into something beautiful. He said to tell you that our people will always remember, and our children's children will know the story." As the sun climbed higher and the desert began to shimmer with heat, they talked of the years that had passed, of the changes that had come to the territory, of the slow but steady growth of understanding between their peoples. Marcus learned that Silver Creek had become a model for other settlements, that the cooperation born during the fever crisis had spread to neighboring areas. The seeds of kindness, planted by a simple act of compassion, had indeed rippled outward like water, touching lives in ways he had never imagined. When it came time to part again, Marcus knew it would not be forever. Paths that were meant to cross would cross again, and the bonds forged by shared humanity were stronger than the divisions created by fear and prejudice. He rode away from the cottonwood grove with a heart full of gratitude, understanding finally that he had received far more than he had given. The crying child he had fed on the trail had fed something in him as well, a hunger for purpose, for connection, for the kind of meaning that comes only from serving something larger than oneself. In saving her, he had saved himself, and in doing so had helped to heal a small piece of the wounded world they all shared. The desert stretched out before him, vast and full of possibilities, and Marcus Thorne rode into it with the confidence of a man who had learned that kindness, like water in the desert, was the most precious gift one person could offer another.